Julie is the director of Connectional Ministries in the Kentucky Conference. The conference our beloved Bishop Leonard Fairley. She is an ordained deacon in the conference, and there she has responsibility for outreach, campus ministry, local church vitality, camp and retreat ministry, disaster response communication, providing resources for 800 local churches and conferences. Does that sound familiar? Previously, she lived in Petersonburg for 10 years, where she served as a church and community worker in ministry with 15 developing congregations. We like that, church and community worker. She has that experience. So she is coming to speak with us today about the work of the Commission of the Way Forward. Julie, we hear you now.
I'll pull this down. It is so good to be with you, and I do want to thank you for the gift of Bishop Leonard Fairley. I get to work with him closely, and it is indeed a joy. Now, there's one thing we're still trying to work on with him. We have really tried to make him a University of Kentucky basketball fan. Okay, but you need to know he has stayed true, and he is a Duke fan, so I won't promise to not keep working on that. I will. But anyway, he is still true to his roots. But thank you for your generosity in sharing him with the whole United Methodist Church and with us specifically in Kentucky. It really is a joy. Come Holy Spirit is one of the favorite phrases I've often said in our work on the commission. And as a recovering perfectionist, I shared that and confessed that to the workshop earlier. That's something for me of letting go of control. And so come Holy Spirit, not to do what I think is right, but to move us into God's will. So it is with convicted humility that I bring before you some of the work we've done on the commission and more about how we have done our work. And I do want to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered here today in this room with persons who have very different perspectives on the topic of LGBTQ inclusion. But we're all here because we deeply love and have invested in the United Methodist Church. Now, I've worked very hard on my language and how it's used, but I also realize when you speak in generalities, hurt can often happen. So I invite you to hold an umbrella of grace over me with this, but please do come speak to me privately afterwards, and I will be happy to listen, and that's how I learn. So I get many questions about serving on the Commission on a Way Forward, but one that I often get is, what's the most difficult thing that has been said to you? Now, while there have been some really unfortunately toned emails or comments, the one that has made for sleepless nights and tears was from my 19-year-old daughter, Eliza, who will be a junior at one of our United Methodist colleges, Birmingham Southern, in the fall. She's exploring a call to ministry. And when we were talking about young adult leadership in the United Methodist Church, she said these words to me that I will never forget. She said, "I hope there is something to lead when we get our chance." I begin with this not to start us on a downward spiral, but to remind us that we aren't dealing with issues. We're talking about calls to ministry. We're talking about souls. We're talking about disciples. We are talking about people we love. And we are to do this work not just for those within our walls, but for those beyond our walls. We are to share the good news with everyone. Staying on mission was so central to our work in the Commission on a Way Forward. I can't tell you how many times we would talk about something and then the question would be raised, will that make the most disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world? That's our mission. So Eliza's words have followed me into my participation on the commission, and I'll be honest with you, this is the hardest leadership work I have ever done, but it's been a joy and an honor and a privilege to be asked to do it. I made some lifelong friends, and please hear that I continue to have hope and see possibility for the United Methodist Church. Now, I'm going to base some of what I'm saying today on a presentation by Dr. Gil Rendell, Reverend Dr. Gil Rendell, who was the coach for our 3 moderating bishops. He shared it with us at our last commission meeting in May. It was sort of a summary of our work together. It was recorded in the hope that that will be available to our delegations as they prepare for General Conference. Now, I've read a lot about adaptive leadership, and I've tried to practice it to the best of my abilities. But Gil, if you've ever had the joy of working with him, is a master of being a non-anxious presence and moving us forward. So I'm going to talk about what's before us. Here's the thing. A lot of you have read every blog post, every Facebook post, everything about the commission, and some of you may not. So let me just share a bit about what is before us. So it is essentially, we have a disagreement about paragraph 161G in our Book of Discipline. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but parts of it are, we affirm all persons are individuals of sacred worth, created in the image of God. The United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. We affirm that God's grace is available to all, and we implore families and churches not to reject or condemn lesbian and gay members and friends. We commit ourselves to ministry for and with all persons. Also, same-sex marriage and our church's role in that, the ordination of self-avowed practicing homosexual persons, also our ability to reach LGBTQ persons and their allies and include them in the life of the church. And we need to name that people are leaving our church over this. Progressive people are leaving, conservative persons are leaving. I talked with a young adult in Kentucky the other day. He left our denomination because we couldn't make a decision about this. And I have no idea where he stands on the particular issue. So let's take a moment and think about where we are. A bit more than 2 years since the 2016 General Conference, which we know is the only group that can speak for the United Methodist Church and the only group that makes any changes to our polity, this international body decided to defer all votes on human sexuality and refer the entire subject to a special commission named by the Council of Bishops. So the bishops nominated several hundred persons, and then 32 of us were asked to serve by the bishops, and then 3 moderating bishops as well. The commission has worked for 1 1/3 years. We have been in dialogue with the Council of Bishops throughout our work. At various times, we presented them with what we call sketches around ideas or models, the One Church Plan, Connectional Conference sketch, which earlier was called branches, and traditionalist. So they moved from sketches to plans within our dialogue. We're also forwarding a proposal around a theological framework and a missional framework that you will see. And the bishops met, and they are recommending the One Church Plan, but that all of the work of the commission will be forwarded to General Conference in 19. And that is where the decision will be made by your delegates. So this is where we are. And while I've outlined some of the basics, it's also important to name that in the midst of this, those blogs I mentioned that have been written, articles have been written, social media posts have been made, opinions have been shared, and here's the thing, all the details aren't out yet, and which I understand is deeply frustrating. I get that. It's a messy time, and it's frustrating, and here's the thing, social media and writing and all those things, that's how we communicate. That is how we communicate in 2018. So we just need to name that we are in the midst of an anxious time. I found that simply naming it and acknowledging the anxiety is very helpful. I've been reading a lot. The commission read a lot together. And one of the authors that I personally read that really helped me through my work on the commission is a man named Thomas Merton. Many of you are familiar with him, or a Trappist Roman Catholic monk from the mid-20th century. In Kentucky, we sort of claim him as our own. His Abbey of Gethsemane, where he spent much of his life, is less than an hour from my home. And I want to share this quote from Thoughts in Solitude that I read before, after I discovered it. I read it before every day of commission to myself. In our age, everything has to be a problem. Ours is a time of anxiety because we have willed it to be so. Our anxiety is not imposed on us by force from outside. We impose it on our world and upon one another from within ourselves. Sanctity in such an age means, no doubt, traveling from the area of anxiety to the area in which there is no anxiety, or perhaps it may mean learning from God to be without anxiety in the midst of anxiety. Perhaps it might mean learning from God to be without anxiety in the midst of anxiety. That's challenging. At least it is for me. You need to hear, I go between anxiety and having a peace all the time. But here's the thing, we got to really believe what it is we preach and what it is we teach and what it is we listen to. How many times in the Bible does it say, do not be afraid? I know there's a technical answer, but the general one is a whole lot. We have relentless reminders of God saying to us, don't worry or be afraid. I am with you always. Always. What is not helpful, I have found, is to dwell on the anxiety and live in it. So I want to share with you the story of how we did our work on the commission on a way forward in the midst of some of that anxiety. We were called together in a different way, and we were called to do a different kind of work. One of the quotes that Gil reminded us of a lot was from Albert Einstein. We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we use to create them. Or these words from Jesus, from Mark. No one sews a piece of new unshrunk cloth on old clothes. No one pours new wine into old wineskins. As the commission, we approached our work in a different way from the beginning, as the bishop set this group to be different than many other groups in our denomination. 32 persons from 9 nations, men and women, straight and gay, laity, elders, deacons, bishops, and a layperson who became a local pastor during our time together. A full span of generations. We even have what we call our commission baby. Casey Langley Orr, a young adult, had Abigail while we were in the midst of the commission, and she only missed one meeting. She's, incredible woman. And we got to meet Abigail at our last meeting. And we had all theologies and positions represented there. Over our time together, we met for 26 days total. Those were the days we were actually together. We ate many meals together. We prayed, we worshiped, we studied the Bible together, we loved, we learned together, and we led together. We became friends. Today, I've been in contact with several commission members. We're all over speaking, and we're all praying for each other as we speak. We continue those connections. The report you will eventually see does not come from like-minded people, but I can confidently say it comes from Christ followers who deeply care for our beloved United Methodist Church. We worked in a conciliar manner. We didn't debate and use parliamentary procedure. During our time, no votes were taken. There were times when some of us were angry, upset, and in tears. But we didn't leave the table for good. As I told the workshop honestly, sometimes some of us got up and walked around the block a few times and came back. But we all came back. I think that's significant, and we worked really hard to make that happen. And we all kept contributing. So our report is a product of conversation, study, prayer, listening, transparency, and trust. Again, we took no votes. As I've reflected on our work and much of the ministry that I've personally been doing in Kentucky with adaptive leadership, here's the one thing that I think is vital and so key. People will say, well, what do you think was the secret? Well, I don't know that there was a secret. It was a lot of hard work, but here's what I think is key to doing adaptive work. As the commission, we spent a lot of time together. Not just those days we were together, but in between, we were on video calls, emailing each other, working on things. We broke bread together many times, and if you'll see in our covenant, in our covenant, which is online, you can see that we talked about we're going to be very intentional about having meals and sitting with persons with whom we disagree. We heard about each other's faith journeys. We heard about cultures very different than our own. And I really don't think there's a shortcut here. If we want to move forward together, we have to be willing to spend time together. And more than one meal occasionally or at a brief church meeting. As wonderful as annual conference is, and I love annual conference, we got to see each other in between. And we've got to spend time together, and we've got to talk about things that sometimes are difficult to talk about. So as we were doing our work in a different way, we spent a lot of time trying to really understand our context. While I've known for years about the global context of the United Methodist Church, I've never fully understood it as I do now. Look at who we are. We are 13 million people. In the U.S., we're in what we call blue and red states. We don't agree on who's going to be representing us in our government. In the U.S., we are in 95% of U.S. counties. We cover a lot of this country, a majority of it. We are in African nations where homosexuality is punishable by the law. We're in the Philippines where our churches are generally conservative, but that nation also just elected their first transgender congresswoman. We're in Western Europe, where many of the countries have legalized same-sex marriage. We're also in Eastern Europe, which is a very different context from Western. And we have many generations, and in general, and this is a huge generality, I know, especially in the U.S., our younger generation has fewer issues with this. So if it's not a problem solving we are choosing, we are going to try a new way of talking and thinking and leading. I said that we repeated the mission a whole lot to make disciples of Jesus Christ. The other thing I read over and over and over was the mission, vision, and scope that the bishops gave to the commission to guide our work. So we are choosing to find a way forward that can be as connected and unified as possible, that can be as agile and responsive and contextual as possible, that can live in and address the widest global and cultural mission field as possible. The as possible is what your delegates to General Conference are going to be working on. What is possible? How can we live together? So a little bit about the timeline. You will see legislation is due on July 7th, and then it'll be translated into 4 languages. Our delegates prepare, they're already preparing, and then in February of 2019 will be the special session of General Conference. Again, to do this, we need to spend a lot of time together. And Bishop Fairley and I have talked, and this is going to be a central part of my ministry in the coming year. So I'm happy to talk with persons. You'll have your delegation to talk with. We need to set up this General Conference differently, folks. We're going to have the same rules. As I said at the workshop earlier, as much as I think what we're going to vote on is important, it is equally important about how we're going to act. Now till General Conference, at General Conference, and beyond. Who better to do this work than Christians, than United Methodists? We can disagree and still love each other. We can do it. We can show the world how to do that. Another book that's been most helpful to me recently is called Canoeing the Mountain. Some of you may have read that, Christian Leadership and Uncharted Territory by Todd Bolsinger. In it, he quotes Margaret Wheatley, who says, "The primary way to prepare for the unknown," and I think we have unknown right now, don't we? The primary way to prepare for the unknown is to attend to the quality of our relationships, to how well we know and trust one another. Being with each other, especially with those whom we might disagree, is an important part of how we live together and how God is calling us to move forward together. So I'm excited to be on this journey with you, and my prayers continue to be with all of our United Methodist Church as we work to find a way forward together for people like my daughter Eliza, who I mentioned earlier, for those in the church walls we love, and all those we haven't met yet. Thank you.